The cold pavement beneath his fur was unforgiving, yet it was the only solace he knew. Every night, as the world bustled on, the German shepherd, worn thin by the elements and time, curled into himself in the dim light of the parking lot. Cars hummed past without a glance, the exhaust stinging his nostrils as they raced into the night. His ears twitched at the sounds of life surrounding him. Laughter spilling out from bars and cafes, the clink of metal from a distant restaurant, but he stayed where he was. He had no reason to move. No one cared. His body was a map of hardship, ribs jutting through the coarse fur, paws cracked and bloodied from the concrete, his eyes wary but sharp, reflecting a lifetime of survival in a place where no one belonged. His name had long been forgotten, lost to the streets, but in his heart, he still remembered the warmth of home, the call of a kind voice, the touch of hands that had once meant love. But that was before the betrayal, before the hunger. Now, all he had were these moments in the parking lot, the sound of distant footsteps, and the shivering darkness. Tonight, like every night, he would wait. But this time, something was different. A figure stood at the edge of the lot. The figure hesitated as if uncertain. Then, as if drawn by something deeper than instinct, it took a step forward, slow and tentative. The dog's tired eyes caught the movement, the faint hope stirring within him. Could it be? Was this the moment that everything would change? The city's lights buzzed endlessly, casting their pale glow over the concrete jungle. And in that forgotten corner of the parking lot, the German shepherd lived his days and nights in a quiet, unspoken surrender. The stray dog was no longer a living creature to most, just a shadow, a part of the urban scenery. The humans who passed by had stopped noticing the thin creature who lurked in the corners, waiting for something he didn't quite believe in anymore. The air was always heavy with the smell of cars, grease, and stale food from nearby eateries. This place, this cold, indifferent space, had become his world, and the streets had become his family. Every night, he lay in the same spot, eyes scanning, ears twitching at the sounds of the world moving forward without him. There was no more running, no more hope, just survival. But survival as he knew it didn't come without scars. His coat was matted, fur falling out in patches where the weather had been unforgiving. His once bright eyes had dimmed, the glint of youthful curiosity replaced by a dull wariness. Yet, despite it all, he still carried a flicker of trust in the pit of his stomach. He could remember, faintly, the love of a family, the joy of chasing after a ball, the laughter of children who held him close. It all seemed so distant now, as if it belonged to someone else, another life. The night was always silent except for the hum of traffic and the distant howls of dogs like him. Dogs who had learned that the world was cruel, that the pavement was their bed and their prison. And then there was the woman. She had seen him twice before. The first time, she had rushed past, eyes straight ahead, trying not to meet the sad gaze of the dog huddled against the curb. The second time, her heart had caught in her throat, an instinct she couldn't shake pulling her attention back. His coat was so thin, his body so fragile. The look in his eyes, half wary, half hopeful, was too familiar. She had been in that place before. Lost, alone, unseen. Her name was Emma. She was a quiet woman, one of those who passed through life unnoticed. No one ever saw the things she carried inside, the small cracks in her that she tried so hard to keep hidden. But the dog, he made her feel something, a connection she couldn't explain. She found herself checking the parking lot every evening, hoping he'd still be there, wondering if he had eaten, wondering if he was okay. One cold evening, as the wind swept through the streets and the smell of rain was in the air, she stood frozen, watching from the distance. The shepherd was lying in his usual spot, his face pressed into the ground, his body curled tightly against the chill. Emma swallowed hard. There was a yearning, deep and desperate, pulling her closer. She didn't know what she was doing. She didn't know why she cared, but she approached. Emma stood at the edge of the parking lot, her breath caught in her chest. The dog's ears perked up, his head turning slowly to face her, his eyes wide and wary. His body tensed, ready to flee or fight, whichever instinct told him to survive. Emma took a cautious step forward, then another, her voice barely a whisper. "Hey there," she said softly, as if speaking too loudly might scare him away. The dog's nostrils flared, his eyes scanning her face as if searching for some sign of sincerity. He didn't trust people. Not anymore. The abandonment, the neglect, it had broken something in him. But Emma's voice wasn't sharp or demanding. It was calm. Tender. She crouched slowly, trying to make herself as small as possible, trying to show him she meant no harm. The dog's head tilted slightly, confusion crossing his face. Was this a trap? Was she another human who would let him down, who would leave him alone again? For what felt like an eternity, Emma stayed there watching him. And then, almost imperceptibly, the dog's body relaxed. His tail twitched, a small sign of hope. A gesture so small, so fragile, that Emma almost missed it. But she didn't. And in that moment, she knew. It would take time. It would take trust. But the journey was beginning. Emma returned every day, bringing food, bringing water, bringing kindness. She didn't rush him, didn't try to force anything. She understood what it meant to be broken, to be afraid of the world, to distrust the hands that reached out. So she waited. Days passed, and slowly the shepherd came closer. First, it was a hesitant sniff of her outstretched hand, then it was a soft nudge of his head against her knee. And finally, it was the quiet surrender, the trust that no one had ever earned from him. One cold evening, Emma arrived with a leash, something she had never dared bring before. The dog's eyes locked onto it with suspicion, but he didn't retreat. She crouched down, and with a trembling hand she clipped the leash to his collar. His fur was matted, his body dirty, but he was no longer just a shadow in the parking lot. He was real. He was there. And with that first step, they walked together, side by side. The first few days in the shelter were overwhelming for the German shepherd. The sounds were strange, the smells too many, the faces too close. But Emma was always there, her presence a constant, her voice soft and calming. The dog, whose name was now Max, settled into his new life, though it was not without its challenges. He was still haunted by memories of his past, still hesitant in his interactions with humans. But with Emma's patience, with her understanding, he began to bloom. Max's fur began to grow back, thick and shiny, his eyes regained their spark, and his tail wagged more often than it didn't. Emma took him to the park every day, watching as he learned to run again, as he leaped for the first time in years, chasing a ball, the sound of his paws on the grass a reminder that, sometimes, there is a chance to start over. As Max stood by her side, looking out over the city skyline, Emma knew that rescue wasn't just about saving a dog. It was about healing, about finding hope in the brokenness, about learning to trust again. And as the sun set, the shadows of the parking lot were nothing but a memory now. The next morning, the light was different. Softer, like the world had been washed clean by the night. Emma sat in the kitchen, her cup of coffee cradled between her hands, watching Max as he stretched out lazily on the floor, his paws outstretched like he was finally learning how to relax. The sounds of the neighborhood outside were louder today. The chatter of children heading to school, the hum of the distant freeway, but none of it seemed to touch the stillness that had settled over them. It was as if the air itself held its breath, waiting. Max, once so brittle, so skittish, was learning how to be a dog again. The soft pads of his feet were no longer calloused and torn, but soft and strong. His coat, once thin and patchy, now gleamed in the soft morning light, the rich brown and black fur blending into the warmth of the sun. Every day his eyes softened a little more, and Emma couldn't help but notice how his once hard expression had begun to show flashes of something else. Hope. They spent that morning walking through the park, a quiet routine that felt like the first step toward something much bigger. The sky was a wide, endless blue, the air sharp with the scent of fresh grass and dew. The park had always been a place of life and joy. Children running in every direction, dogs barking excitedly as they chased each other, the wind dancing through the trees. And yet Max walked through it all with an old caution, his ears flicking at every noise, his body still stiff with the uncertainty of his past. But there was something else now, something that hadn't been there before. A small wag of his tail, a glance up at Emma, his eyes meeting hers for a heartbeat longer than usual. And slowly, Max was learning to let the world in again. That evening, as the sun dipped lower into the horizon, Emma took a deep breath, and sat down next to Max on the front porch, watching the stars begin to prick through the sky, one by one. It was hard to believe how far they'd come, how far he'd come. A month ago, she could never have imagined this moment. The quiet companionship they had shared. She could never have imagined the joy in his eyes. The way his tail now wagged freely when she called his name. The way his ears perked when she spoke. She had given him something he hadn't known he needed, but in doing so, he had given her something she hadn't even realized was missing. Max was more than just a dog now. He was family. He was a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness have the most profound impact. And that was something Emma held in her heart every single day. But that night, as she leaned back against the cool wood of the porch, a familiar thought tugged at the edges of her mind. The parking lot was still there. She could picture it. The familiar dark corners, the empty expanse, the cars that moved in and out without stopping. She could almost hear the sound of Max's paws against the concrete, the coldness of the air against his fur. That parking lot had been his world for so long, and in some ways it would always be part of him. But he was no longer trapped there. He had a home now, and Emma, in her quiet way, had given him the most precious thing she could ever offer, a second chance. She glanced down at Max, who had fallen asleep at her feet, his head resting peacefully against the soft fabric of her jeans. A soft smile tugged at the corners of her mouth, her heart full as she whispered into the night, "You're home now, Max. You're home." The cool night air wrapped around them like a blanket, the stars above twinkling gently, as if the world itself were witnessing this moment. And in that moment, Emma knew with absolute certainty that the past could never define them. They had each other now. They had built something new, something full of love and trust and hope. And nothing, not even the shadows of the past, could take that away. Max shifted slightly in his sleep, his body curling closer to her, his soft breath a steady rhythm in the silence. Emma closed her eyes, letting the quiet of the night fill her, feeling the weight of the day lift as the world slowed down. It wasn't just the dog who had been saved. It was both of them. The rescue had never just been about Max. It had been about Emma too, learning that there was always room for growth, for forgiveness, for love. And the parking lot, with all its memories and hardships, would always be there. But tonight it was just a place, just a memory. What mattered now was the present. What mattered now was the love that had been born from the darkness. And as the night deepened, Emma and Max sat there together, side by side, watching the stars flicker in the vast, endless sky. Home at last. As the weeks turned into months, Emma and Max found a rhythm, a quiet bond that deepened with every passing day. The house that had once felt too empty, too quiet, now felt alive with the soft shuffle of paws across the floor and the warm thump of a tail against the walls. Emma had always prided herself on her independence, on carving out a life that was hers, until Max came into it. And now, he had become the heartbeat of her days, the thing that anchored her in the small moments. One afternoon, Emma sat at her kitchen table, working through a stack of papers, but her thoughts kept drifting to Max. She glanced over at him, curled up by the window. His eyes half closed as he watched the world outside. It wasn't the same vigilance he had once held. There was no longer the tension in his muscles, no longer the nervous flick of his tail at every sound. He was safe now. He was home. And yet, as she watched him, there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that still seemed distant, still haunted by memories she would never fully understand. Max had come so far. But sometimes Emma couldn't help but wonder if there was more to his silence than she could see. She stood up and walked over to him, her feet silent against the wooden floor. Max lifted his head as she approached, his eyes still heavy with the quiet that had become his default. She bent down beside him, running a hand gently over his fur. His body shifted under her touch, not as tense as before, but still slightly guarded. She smiled softly, a quiet acknowledgement of how far they had both come. And then, as she sat next to him, she couldn't help but ask softly, "What are you thinking, buddy?" The question wasn't meant to be answered, not really. It was more of a way to acknowledge the space between them, the space where the unspoken lived. Max shifted slightly, resting his head back down, but his eyes never left her. and for a moment, she thought she saw a trace of the same longing in him that she felt in herself. An echo of something lost, something that time might never heal. He had survived the streets, but there was a tenderness in him, something too fragile to put into words. Emma wondered if it was the same for her, if she, too, carried the ghosts of a past she couldn't outrun. The world outside continued its hum, the wind rustling the leaves, the distant sounds of people laughing, of cars driving by. But inside the house, it was quiet. And in that quiet, Emma realized how much she had come to depend on this peaceful companionship. It wasn't the kind of love that burned brightly, demanding attention. It was subtle, patient, like a slow river flowing underneath everything, constantly shifting, always steady. One evening, while Emma and Max were out for their nightly walk through the park, they came across something unexpected. Another dog, this one young and full of energy, darting playfully between the trees. Max froze for a moment, his body stiffening as he watched the dog with wide eyes. Emma glanced at him, a soft frown pulling at her lips. Max hadn't been around many other dogs since he'd come into her life. There had been a few tentative meetings at the park, but he had always kept his distance, retreating into the safety of Emma's presence, unsure of how to navigate the world of other dogs. This time was different. As the other dog bounded closer, Max took a step back, but then something shifted. It was subtle, a slight softening of his stance. A brief glance in Emma's direction as if seeking reassurance. She gave him a gentle nod, and for the first time since he had come into her life, Max stepped forward, his tail beginning to wag just a little. The other dog approached, tail high and ears perked with curiosity. Max hesitated for a moment, but then ever so cautiously, he sniffed the air. A slow, almost tentative step forward, and then another. And then, before Emma knew it, Max and the other dog were walking side by side, their tails wagging in sync. Emma stood there watching them, her heart swelling in her chest. It was a small thing, this moment, a moment of connection, of learning, of trust. But to her it was everything. Max wasn't just healing, he wasn't just surviving, he was learning to live again. He was learning to find joy in the world around him, to reach out to others without the weight of the past holding him back. When they returned home that night, Emma sat on the couch, Max at her feet, his body once again relaxed. It had been a quiet evening, but it had been a revelation in its own way. The path ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would be moments when Max would still carry the weight of his past, moments when he would retreat into his old ways. But today had been a breakthrough. Emma leaned down, her fingers brushing through his fur as he lay beside her. She whispered, "You did good today, buddy. I'm proud of you." Max turned his head to look up at her, his eyes soft, his body relaxed in a way it hadn't been when they first met. It was a moment of peace between them, of quiet understanding. And as the moonlight filtered through the window, Emma realized that the journey they had taken together was far from over. There would always be more to learn, more to heal, more to grow. But as long as they had each other, they could face it together. They didn't need words to know it. The silence between them spoke volumes. The years passed, each one bringing its own set of challenges, but each one also bringing new moments of joy, new milestones, new connections. Max learned to trust again, to love again, and Emma, in turn, learned that healing didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, patient process, like the gradual turning of a tide. But with Max by her side, she knew she would never be alone in the struggle. As the sun set on their quiet home, the last golden rays spilling through the trees, Emma sat on the porch once more, Max beside her. They had come so far, both of them. And as they sat together, watching the sky darken and the stars appear, Emma realized that the parking lot, the cold pavement where Max had once lain, was no longer a part of his story. It was just a memory now. What mattered was the here and now. What mattered was the love between them, unspoken but understood. And as Max leaned his head against her leg, Emma whispered once more, "You're home now, buddy. You're home." The night stretched out before them, the air crisp and full of possibility. And in that quiet, unspoken moment, Emma and Max knew that they had found what they had both been searching for, not in the past, but in each other. The seasons rolled by, and with each passing day, Emma and Max became more intertwined. Their lives had grown together so seamlessly that it was hard to remember what it had been like before. There were mornings when Emma woke to find Max curled up at her feet, his body warm and solid, a silent promise of companionship. Even in his sleep, he was no longer tense, no longer guarded. The nightmares that had once plagued him in the early days seemed to be fading into the distance, replaced by a soft trust that had taken root in his heart. Max had become her constant, and as much as she had given him a second chance, he had given her one too. Emma often found herself reflecting on how different life felt with him in it. She'd once been a woman content to live alone, finding solace in her independence. But now, her life was richer. The quiet moments were no longer isolating, they were peaceful, even sacred. Max had filled a space she hadn't known was empty, and the house that had once felt too big, too hollow, was now full of life. Every corner, every room, echoed with the rhythm of his paws, the rustle of his fur, the quiet sound of him breathing deeply beside her. But even in their quiet contentment, Emma could still sense the remnants of Max's past lingering in the background. He had learned to trust again, but there were still moments when something would trigger his old fears. A sudden noise, a quick movement, the flash of headlights cutting through the night. These things would send him skittering back into the shadows of his past, the pain of abandonment still fresh in his mind, though it had softened with time. But Emma didn't rush him through it. She let him take his time, always there beside him when he needed her, understanding the spaces he needed to fill at his own pace. And then there was the day, a soft Sunday afternoon, when everything seemed to shift once more. Emma had planned a quiet day. The weather was warm but not too hot, the kind of day that beckoned you to spend hours outdoors, surrounded by the scent of fresh grass and the hum of distant voices. Max was lying in the backyard, his body stretched lazily across the cool grass, his eyes half closed in contentment as he watched the birds flit above him. He was more at peace than Emma had ever seen him before. His tail thumped lazily against the ground as if to say, "This is home. This is where I belong." But then the doorbell rang, sharp and unexpected. Emma's heart skipped a beat. Who could it be? She wasn't expecting anyone. Max's head lifted immediately, his ears perking up. His body stiffened, a slight twitch in his shoulders, a reminder that even in the safety of their home, he was always alert, always aware. Emma glanced at him, her eyes soft with understanding. She walked slowly to the door, her hand on the handle, wondering who was on the other side. When she opened it, she found herself face to face with a man she didn't recognize. He was older, his features weathered with age, his eyes sharp but soft, as if he carried years of regret with him. "Excuse me," he began, his voice low but tinged with an emotion Emma couldn't quite place. I'm looking for a dog, a German shepherd. I think he's been here." His voice faltered and he paused, as if unsure how to continue. His name was Max. Emma's heart dropped into her stomach. She didn't answer right away, her mind racing, trying to process the words. "Max," the man continued, his hands trembling slightly. I was his owner. I had to let him go a few years ago. I thought he'd run away. I thought he'd be fine. But when I saw him on that street, in that parking lot, I knew I had to find him. I couldn't let him live like that anymore." Emma stood frozen for a moment, the words hanging heavy between them. The man looked down at the ground, his eyes filled with something Emma couldn't decipher, guilt, regret, or perhaps both. He glanced up at her, his eyes searching her face for any sign of recognition, of understanding. "I never wanted to abandon him," he whispered, his voice cracking. I was just too lost myself. I wasn't ready for him, not then. But I want to make things right. I want him to know that I'm here, that I care. If you'll let me." Emma stood there, torn between the desire to protect the life she had built for Max and the raw emotion that pulsed in the man's voice. Her heart twisted with conflicting feelings. She understood the pain of losing someone, of making mistakes. But Max had been through so much. He had found a life with her. He had found peace. Could she really ask him to revisit the past? Could she let him go, knowing the damage it might do to the fragile trust he had built? Max stood up from the grass and slowly padded to the door, his steps hesitant, his body tense. His eyes locked onto the man, his tail stiff, his ears drawn back. There was no mistaking the wariness in his eyes. Emma watched him closely, waiting, unsure of what he would do, unsure of what she should do. For a long moment, the three of them stood there, the weight of unspoken histories pressing heavily on the air. Finally, Max took a slow step forward. His body still stiff, but there was something else, something softer. A tentative sniff of the air. He stood still, watching the man, his head cocked to the side, trying to understand. The man crouched down, his hands outstretched, trembling as they hovered just inches from Max. "Max," he whispered, his voice raw. "It's me, boy. It's me, I'm sorry. I should have never left you." Max's eyes remained locked on his, but then slowly, cautiously, he took a step forward, his nose brushing the man's hand. A moment, a brief moment, and Emma held her breath. For a second, everything seemed to stop. The world, the sounds, the air itself hung suspended in that single fragile moment. Max looked up at Emma, his eyes searching her face, as if asking for permission. Emma's heart tightened in her chest. She kneeled down beside him, her hands resting on his back, grounding him in this moment. "It's your choice, Max," she said softly, her voice trembling. "You're free to choose." And in that instant, Max made his decision. He leaned into the man's touch, his tail giving a tentative wag. But Emma knew deep down that the road ahead would not be easy. There would be healing, more of it, for all of them. But for now, there was peace in this new chapter. It wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about learning to move forward together. And as the man gently petted Max, Emma stood up, stepping back to give them space. She could feel the weight of everything, the choices, the love, the trust. And she understood something she hadn't before. Love, she realized, was not just about holding on. It was about letting go when it was time. And so, as Max stood there, between the two of them, Emma whispered softly, "I'll always be here. Buddy, you've always had a home with me." And she meant it. But now, Max had a new chance. A chance to heal. A chance to find peace in a world that had once been too harsh. It wasn't the end of their journey. It was just another beginning. The sun was beginning to set as Emma drove back home, the warm, golden light spilling over the horizon, casting long shadows across the road. She had said goodbye to Max just a few minutes ago, watching him walk into Daniel's house, his body relaxed and tail wagging, a small sign of peace after all these years. But as she turned the car onto the familiar streets leading to her home, a quiet heaviness settled in her chest. It wasn't sadness exactly. No, it was something deeper, something more tender, like the lingering warmth after a fire has burned out, leaving the air rich with memories. She couldn't stop herself from thinking about the parking lot, the cold concrete where Max had once slept every night. The place that had been his world for so long, the place that had scarred him, hardened him. It had been the place where he had learned to survive, but it had never been home. Home, Emma realized, wasn't just about where you lived. It was about the people, the love, the safety that wrapped around you, that gave you the freedom to just be. As Emma pulled into her driveway, she took a deep breath, letting the stillness of the evening wash over her. The house was quiet without Max, without the sound of his paws clicking on the floor, his gentle breathing by her side. It felt different, but it wasn't empty. No, it was filled with something else now. Something soft, something hopeful. She stepped out of the car, the scent of the evening air filling her lungs, and paused for a moment, looking up at the sky. The stars were just beginning to pierce through the darkening blue, faint and quiet, like the small moments of peace that had come into Max's life. She hadn't been sure what to expect when she first took Max in, whether he would ever trust her, whether he would ever be the same dog he had been before the streets had broken him. But now, standing there alone, the weight of the last few years wrapped in her chest, Emma knew Max had found peace. He had found a place to heal, to grow, to love again. And it hadn't been about rescuing him, not really. It had been about letting him rescue himself, about giving him the space to remember who he was before the world had hardened him. And in doing so, she had rescued herself too. Max had reminded her of something she had forgotten, that love was not just something we give, but something we receive, something we grow with. He had shown her what it meant to trust again, to forgive, to open up after the world had knocked you down. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from Daniel. "Max is resting now, calm and happy. Thank you, Emma, for everything." She smiled softly, her heart swelling with quiet pride. She had done what she needed to do, what Max had needed her to do. She had given him the chance to live, really live, again. And she had set him free. Turning back toward the house, Emma paused for a moment before entering. The silence was different now. It wasn't lonely. It was the kind of silence that comes after a storm, when everything is still and the air is fresh. Emma knew that this chapter had come to its end, but there would always be the echoes of it in her heart. She wasn't just a rescuer. She was a witness to Max's transformation, his journey from darkness into light, from abandonment into trust. And as she stepped inside, her eyes fell on the empty spot where Max had once slept, the soft imprint of his body still lingering in the fabric of the couch. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of memories, full of love, full of a journey that would never truly end. In the quiet of the evening, with the stars outside twinkling softly, Emma closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of everything, the heartache, the healing, the joy, and as she exhaled, a soft smile curved on her lips. Max had come home. He had found peace. And in doing so, so had she. The journey wasn't over. It was only just beginning.